welcoming everybody. My name's Rebecca Gill. I'm the Executive Director of ROSA, and I'd like to welcome you to our 2022 Summer Conference. It's brilliant that over 300 people have registered for the event over the next 2 days, and we're really looking forward to meeting so many of you. This year, our conference offers the chance to reflect, connect and celebrate. Reflect on the immense work of women's and girls' organisations in every part of the United Kingdom. Organisations that are speaking truth to power, holding the powerful to account, challenging the systems and structures which oppress so many women and girls every single day. Our conference is a chance to reflect on the tangible, practical and often life-saving support that so many of you give to women and girls across their lives. Our conference also offers a chance for us to connect, to meet old friends, to make some new ones, and to remind ourselves that we are not alone, that you are not alone. Whether your organisation is delivering services, influencing public policy, or campaigning for changes in the law, your organisations are facing the same challenges with funding, with being heard and seen, with being able to demonstrate your impact and the difference you make to people so that they can hear. At a time when the world is rolling back women's and girls' rights, when our bodies are under attack from anti-abortionists and from violent men, when our access to maternity and parental rights hangs in the balance, when women's specific health needs are ignored, when so many women cannot find adequate childcare so that they can access employment, and when they do work, they face low or unequal pay, when women who are refugees or are seeking asylum are criminalised, marginalised and abused, and when millions of women are in poverty in this country, one of the richest nations in the world, and millions more are heading towards poverty, it is really hard to stay positive. So we have to use opportunities like this conference to remind ourselves and each other that women's and girls' organisations are the solution. You are the solution. You are the glue that holds women, holds communities, holds nations together. Your work is valuable and it is vital, and we celebrate that. We know your value. Rosa knows how important your work is. We are on your side and we are by your side, and we are really excited to reflect on what you do, connect you with others, and celebrate the work you do and the change you make. I'm really looking forward to meeting and hearing from so many of you over the next 2 days. And I'm delighted that we can move on to the first session, which is looking at the current cost of living crisis. We call this session Ports in a Storm because of the vital role that many women's and girls' organisations have always played in supporting women facing poverty and significant hardship. This is set to get worse in the coming months. And I'm really delighted to welcome the speakers for today's session. We've got Amina Elmi from Granby Somali Women's Project. I think she's going to be coming onto the stage. We've got Sarah Ronan from Women's Budget Group, and we've got MacLeod from Women's Support Project. We've got Amina, we've got Sarah, and we've got Jan here as well. So I'd like to welcome you all to the stage. And I would like to, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to be asking them some questions. So Amina, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Amina Elmi. I work for Granby Somali Women's Group, which is a grassroots organisation based in Liverpool that works with women, girls and families from the BAME community, especially those who face a language barrier.
Brilliant. And Jan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi Rebecca, good morning. Yes, I'm Jan MacLeod from the Women's Support Project. We're based in Glasgow and we work across Scotland to raise awareness of violence against women and for improved service responses. In terms of sort of priority issues at the moment, we do a lot of work on commercial sexual exploitation, and our direct support services are aimed at migrant, refugee and asylum seeking women particularly those that have suffered violence. And we're part of the UK-wide Labyrinth project led by Solace Women's Aid as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And Sarah, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Good morning, thanks for having me. My name's Sarah Ronan. I'm from the Women's Budget Group, and we analyse and monitor the impact of government policy on men and women, and we promote policies that will help to create a gender equal economy and future, and we pay particular attention to the role of care and responsibilities and care within that. And right now have a heavy focus obviously on the cost of living. So it's great to be here today to be able to share our thoughts on that too.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, everybody. So the way we're structuring today's webinar is I've got some questions that I'm going to ask Amina and Jan and Sarah, and then there'll be time for the audience to ask questions as well. So my first question for each of you is, can you describe how you are seeing the cost of living crisis affecting women and girls? And Amina, could you start with that one, please?
Yes, sure. I think as a grassroots organisation dealing with people on a daily basis, the one thing we're noticing at the moment, the biggest effect probably is fuel costs, gas and electricity. A lot of people are coming into the organisation. The bills jump from, say, £50 to £200, £250. They don't have the money or the resources to pay these bills. And they're asking us what we can access and how we can help them to actually reduce their bills at the same time, but also work with the suppliers and seeing what budget payments they can make so that they can meet the cost, but also heat their homes. A lot of the people that we deal with are single parents, single mothers, and they're the ones that are home with their kids, usually have the gas and electricity on, so they need access to that. So we're seeing a sharp rise in that area, most definitely. Also, the cost of living has affected food costs. So we're seeing a lot more families coming in asking us about which food banks they can access. Are there any resources they can access here? Signing their children up for projects that happen at the summer holidays and Easter and half terms and things like that, which will allow their children to take part in the activity, but also get a hot meal during the day. So we're seeing an increase in those areas, most definitely. Also, childcare is another issue. We've got a lot of parents who are on universal credit, mothers. Their children haven't even got to the age of 5, but they're being told they have to look for employment. If they're looking for employment and able to find it, and usually the employment they find is 0-hour contracts, how are they able to pay for childcare costs? So they're coming into us with that dilemma and saying, what can we do in this area? So we're seeing areas like that, the cost of living effects and things like that. Also, we had a number of service users that came in just last week saying that her rent was like £500 a month. It had been increased by the private landlord to £750. Where was she going to get these additional costs from? So we're seeing all of these things when it comes to the cost of living crisis.
Wow, thanks so much, Amina. Sarah, could you talk a bit about how you're seeing the cost of living crisis affecting women and girls?
Sure. So I guess at the Women's Budget Group, our perspective is a little bit different because we're not a support services organisation and on the front line like Amina and Jan are. So I can tell you a little bit about what we expect to see, I guess. And we look at the economics of it, and what we know about the cost of living crisis is that it's going to hit the poorest the hardest, and women are more likely to be poor. So we earn less, hello, gender pay and pension gap. We own less, we have lower levels of wealth and savings than men. So we don't have that cushion, you know, that financial cushion to be able to help us absorb things like rising costs. We also have higher levels of debt as well, and that increased quite significantly over the pandemic. And we expect that that is going to increase further. And a lot of that debt is usually incurred by women just to bridge that earnings gap too. And of course, women are also hardest hit by cuts to public services over the last decade to 13 years. So where you have things like cuts to like adult social care provision, you also find that women then are reducing their paid hours of work in order to fill that gap. So that's obviously impacting women's ability to earn money, impacting their ability to eroding their resilience, really their financial resilience, to be able to deal with something like this. And one of the most significant things, I think one of the most influential things in terms of how women are able to cope with the cost of living crisis is, of course, the social security system. So we've had over a decade of cuts to social security, and the uprating that we had in April of 3.1%, that's only a third of what inflation was in that month. So if you're on benefits, you are experiencing a very significant real terms cut in your income, and women are more likely to rely on social security for all of part of their income. So women are really, we've seen an erosion of women's financial resilience over the last 10 years, including the pandemic, and it makes us very susceptible to this crisis. But then I'm really glad Amina brought up the topic of childcare, because also the other side of this is that we regularly have government ministers coming out and saying, well, you can earn your way out of the cost of living crisis, increase your hours of work, go out and get work. But how do you do that when childcare is so unaffordable and so inaccessible? So there's another barrier there again to kind of how women are able to cope and find ways of coping with the crisis. So I think the combination of cuts to social security, things like unaffordable childcare, is really, really going to squeeze women and make women particularly vulnerable to this.
That's so helpful. Thank you, Sarah. And Jan, how are you seeing the cost of living crisis affecting women and girls?
Well, I was going to say practically exactly what Amina said. It's really just exacerbating existing inequalities. Food, fuel and digital poverty are major issues that are meaning that women are facing hardship and increasing inclusion. In terms of food, I think we've probably all seen the publicity about the fact that cheaper foods have risen like by a bigger proportion. And also I've noticed myself, when you go to the supermarket, like the own brand ranges are all sold out. Bus fares are very expensive in Glasgow, where we're based. Women on a low income, they can't afford to travel about the city for cheaper food. We had a woman last week who said she can only afford one bus ticket a week. So if she has to do anything, any appointments or visiting people, she tries to do it all in one day, so she can use the one all-day ticket. I'd agree very much with the comments about childcare, and the women who use our Rights and Choices service, this is a bit of a generalisation, but quite a number of them do have quite large families. So you're very often talking about 3 children under the age of 5. They're being told that they have to work in some cases, depending on their circumstances, and they can't study ESOL if they need to learn English because there's no childcare provided for the ESOL. I just wanted to mention a different area of work, which is the fact that we've noted a marked increase in women entering the sex industry. First of all, during the pandemic, when women lost employment, and now because of the cost of living rise. So services that support women in street prostitution are saying that they're seeing women returning to that have been out for maybe 10 years. And there's been a real explosion of younger women moving into things like webcamming and selling images. But because the market is so flooded with women who are being pushed into that situation, they're finding that they're not actually earning very much money. So they tend to get pushed more into the even more exploitative forms of selling or exchanging sex.
That's incredibly interesting. Thank you, Jan. And I think what's very striking about all of you, and I hear what you say, Sarah, about the fact that you don't do direct service delivery, but I think the work of Women's Budget Group in being able to sort of show that kind of bigger picture is critical for also joining up with and explaining some of the experiences that Amina and Jan are talking about kind of at the grassroots. And I think what's very striking is that all of you have talked about kind of mothers and single mothers. Jan, you've just touched on women kind of returning back to the sex industry. Sarah, you talked about sort of the pay and the pensions gap and that kind of issue for older women. And I wondered whether you are seeing at your different kind of levels of relationship with the issue, whether there are women and girls who are finding it particularly difficult at the moment. And I'll put that question to you, Jan. So women who are facing specific challenges.
I mean, you could just say that anybody who's on a very low income, you know, the difficulties have really multiplied. In terms of our direct experience, I would definitely mention migrant women and the problems caused with Brexit. So we have quite a number of women who are African. They might come from Somalia, for example, or other African countries, but they have European passports. And then they're moving to the UK, but because of Brexit, they're not entitled to benefits. So again, they're trying to work, they're trying to survive on like 15 hours a week and tax credits or something, whatever. A number of the women that we work with in that situation, they've actually fled violence as part of the reason that they came here. So they're having to try to deal with the trauma of that and possibly the threat of ongoing violence whilst they're still having to negotiate all these additional barriers. I think as well, even women who've been settled here for a long time, the cost of living crisis and poverty in general makes it harder for them to leave if they're suffering violence within the home. And then if they do leave, they're living in very poor conditions. And again, like the competition for cheaper goods is so much greater. So we have women who've been living for years with like no carpets or curtains, like very poor conditions in the house. And it has a real knock-on effect on the family. You know, if you've got kids, especially young teenagers, they don't want to bring their friends home. You know, if their friends are going to say, we've got no carpets here. And just like women are not able to make a proper family meal because they can't afford to have the oven on or to, you know, like cook a lot of food. So it's just how one thing adds to the other that you have to understand before you realise like just quite how devastating the impact is.
That's extremely interesting. So there's little knock-on effects and how long-term that impact's going to be. Absolutely fascinating. Amina, the same question to you. Are there women and girls in particular, or particularly women and girls who are facing more significant challenges that you're finding?
I think most definitely. I think the benefit system with universal credit, we find a lot of the women that come in and use that service, everything's now on the internet, so you have to be computer literate. And if they're not computer literate, they're unable to get into the portal and do A, B, and C, and D, and then sanctions are imposed. So what we're doing at the moment is our support workers are opening up the portals on the system on our computers, and they have to come in and see the support workers when they're available, so they can access their portals, so they're not sanctions, and that's having a knock-on effect. Another thing that we're seeing is when it comes to if you're in a family and say there is a mother and there's 4 or 5 girls, what about the fact that when it comes to sanitation and things like period pads and things like the cost of that, how are they making the cost of that up? And that's one thing they come to us and they say, is there anywhere we can get pads from and things like that, because we can't afford to buy them from the supermarkets because there's 3 or 4 girls in the family. So that's another area. We're also seeing an increase in women's-based violence. When it comes to young girls, they like to go out at the weekend, they like to go drinking and things like that, and then they can't afford a taxi home anymore. Even if they get the bus is not going to take them to their front door. So that walking home thing is completely dangerous, and a lot more girls are scared in those areas. So we're seeing things like that. We're also seeing even if you're a young lady and you're working and you're on a 0-hour contract, you can still be poor. because that 0 hours are still not providing you enough to live on. So even if the government's saying to people, go out there, if you're employed, you'll be fine. Now, there's a lot of people who are employed on 0 contract hours and they're still poor. So it's situations like that we're seeing with the cost of living crisis.
Wow. And Sarah, have you got any reflections on particular women that you are seeing being affected by the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, we're producing a series of briefings on the cost of living crisis that's looking at all of this, and is going to kind of pull it out in a bit more detail, looking at specific groups. But certainly there are certain communities where there are higher levels of poverty anyway, and the women in those communities will really feel this acutely. So, you know, like the Bangladeshi community has, you know, 53% are living in poverty, compared to 19% of white people. So in those communities, you are going to see women feeling it more acutely. I think as well, this is, and we know this has been covered a little bit and mentioned even kind of in the cost of living measures, but disabled women, because obviously even before this crisis hit, disabled people were facing on average an extra £583 in costs every month, due to their, you know, condition and their needs and accessibility needs and all the rest of it. And if you are charging mobility devices or your home a lot, that's naturally going to increase your energy consumption. So we're concerned about how that's going to play out, particularly in October, you know, because we've just had a price cap rise and we're in the mildest part of the year, you know, so come October, that's pretty frightening, really. And of course, single parents as well, 90% of whom are women, that already incur large amounts of debt anyway, and that got a lot worse during the pandemic. A third of single parents were in financial difficulty, 11% were in problem debt, and even before the pandemic hit, 84% of single parents had less than £1,500 in savings. So it goes back again to that financial resilience, and there being no buffer there in order to be able to cope with rising costs. Because I think a really important point here, just to slightly go off topic about why I keep coming back to that financial resilience piece, is that this is not just about rising prices. This is a crisis of income. And if you look at it through that lens, you can really understand why it is going to impact women and girls so much more, because women earn less. And for single parents, that's especially true because they're the breadwinner and the caregiver. So we are very concerned about how this is going to play out for single parents. We obviously, you know, as Jan will know, women that are experiencing domestic violence, it's going to be a lot harder to leave if you can't come up with that money, or you can't, support yourself and your children once you leave. And the flip side of that, of course, is that it's not just about the individual's capacity to leave, but the capacity of support service organisations, you know, to support those women to leave abusive relationships, because those organisations are going to be feeling the impact of increased overheads and costs as well. So, and women, migrant women with no recourse to public funds, because if they lose a job or they find themselves in an abusive relationship that they have to leave, they don't have that social security safety net to be able to help them to deal with the cost of living. So there's lots of groups of women where this is really, you know, really going to be felt quite acutely.
That's really interesting, actually, Sarah. And I think what I'd reflect on from some of the points that all three of you have made is that there are specific women, and we've talked about race, we've talked about some women from particular racialised and minority ethnic groups, we've talked about parents and single parents in particular, the issue around women experiencing violence, male violence and abuse, and that fear of leaving, women who have disabilities and live with disabilities. And I imagine that they all need, that each kind of group of women needs often a slightly different level of support and a different type of support. And I suppose my question, and I'll start with you, Sarah, is what do you think are the most urgent things that is needed that would help women today and into the next year or two? Like what needs to happen kind of now and in the next 12 months that would really see a reversal of the crisis that we're facing and that we're in? And I'll start with you, Sarah, if that's okay. Oh, is Sarah frozen?
Oh, I'm back, I think.
Oh, you're
There
back.
we go. Yeah, I did catch that. I could hear you. Sorry. Yeah, I think I'm going to come back again to that point that I just made about it being as much a crisis of incomes as it is about rising prices. You know, we've had a decade of wage suppression and low wage growth. So on average, workers experience a real term pay cut of 1.9%. In the public sector, that's even greater. It's 4.2%. But for women, that crisis of income isn't just about pay and the fact that, you know, we work less hours and all of that because of our caring responsibilities. It is really impacted by the social security system. So as an urgent, immediate thing, we need reform of the fabric of the social security system. It has been eroded for over a decade. We have seen things like the £20 lifeline during the pandemic that was removed, and then we had the 3.1% up rating, which is completely inadequate. We need to see an up rating of benefits in line with inflation. At a minimum, we need to see child benefit increase to £50 per child. We need to see the 2-child limit, the benefits cap removed, which is really punitive for large families, you know, and even the measures that were announced in May by the Chancellor, they really only benefit smaller families. They, you know, you get large families with 3-4 kids that are, you know, receiving the same amount of support as a single person. It doesn't make sense. So we really need to, that is the most immediate urgent thing, and it's within the capability of the government to be able to do that. So that's something that would provide immediate relief. But the other thing as well is that, and you know, I'm Women's Budget Group, I'm ex-pregnant then screwed, I'm going to come back to childcare all the time, right? We need reform of childcare. If you want to keep telling people that they need to get out to work and you want to give people access to increased earnings, then you absolutely have got to do something about childcare. We have reached an emergency critical point with childcare. People are paying more on childcare than they are on mortgage and rent. It is social infrastructure. It is an essential service. Last week when we had the rail strikes, the government were lamenting the fact that people couldn't get to work because they couldn't access this vital infrastructure of rail and train systems. Well, wait till they hear about the amount of women that can't get to work because they can't access vital infrastructure of childcare. So I think let's focus on the social security system. We need to completely reform that and rebuild it. We need to uprate benefits in line with inflation, but we need to pay attention as well to childcare, because if we want women to be able to get out to work and be able to support their families and cope with this cost of living crisis, then we have to make it possible for them to do that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's such a helpful response. And Jan, what would you think are the most urgent issues today and in the next 12 months to 2 years?
Well, I think everything that Sarah said, absolutely. Childcare is such a problem, and it causes such stress and anxiety when it's coupled with the pressure to get a job, or when, you know, if you don't get a job, you get nothing. Like, you know, for example, the women that I said had, you know, problems caused by the Brexit changes. And again, that's where we're seeing women getting pushed into the sex industry. So very, very much affordable childcare, and like local affordable childcare as well, that doesn't involve, you know, traveling for an hour and a half across the city or something like that. I think overall what we need is a universal minimum income, and steps that will look at addressing that gap between a change in your circumstances or claiming benefits for the first time, and you've got 6, 8 or more weeks where you don't get anything. Sarah's mentioned that a lot of people don't have savings, or they've got minimal savings. So what are you supposed to do in that time, particularly if most of your family and friends are struggling as well and they don't have enough money to see you through? So people are going to be forced into debt before they even get benefits that they'll find it very, very difficult to get back out of. In sort of more particular things, more immediate things, women are so stressed at the moment about the school holidays. How do you feed your children during the holidays? What are you going to do with them? Again, bus fares are so expensive, so you can't take advantage sometimes even of the free facilities that are organised by your local council or whatever. And it's not just the summer holidays. The summer holidays are obviously worse because they're longer, but every school holiday puts extra pressure. And then the return to school, you've got school uniforms, school shoes, winter shoes and jackets, all these things. We're seeing women who before were managing, who are now having to go around charity shops, approach charities, use food banks. So again, that has quite a impact on people's mental health and well-being, because obviously as soon as your standard of living drops, and you're doing things that you didn't think you would ever have to do, like go to a food bank when you've got a job or when you've not got a job, whichever, then the worry that things will get worse, you know, like what if something breaks in the house? What if you've got an abusive ex-partner who's going to come in and smash up your furniture? What if he does that quite regularly? Where are you going to get replacements? I think as well, like higher level action for things like access to Wi-Fi would make a vast difference as well for families on very low incomes. Their children are getting educated online largely, and if they don't have Wi-Fi at home, how do they keep up? How do you study, do your college work, apply for your benefits, find out information on anything? It's all online. And if we could have a wider solution to that with free Wi-Fi, it would make a massive difference.
Very interesting. Thanks, Jan. And Amina, what do you think are the most urgent things that are needed for women today, but also going into the near future?
I think Jan and Sarah covered quite a lot of the things that I was going to say in this area, most definitely. One thing I am going to pick up on that Jan was saying, it's about what you call telephone poverty. A lot of people live in telephone poverty, and we see that because people come into the centre constantly and they're saying to us, we need to contact the benefit agency, or we need to contact Liverpool City Council because they've got a scheme available at the moment where they're going to give us some money towards our fuel costs. It takes an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and a half to get through to those service provisions. Where are they going to find the money to actually pay those telephone bills if they can't even pay for their fuel costs at home? So it's things like that we're constantly seeing. If I was going to go through a list, I'd say a reduction in gas and electricity, free childcare, bringing the cost of food down, even bringing the cost of travel down at this moment in time. It's so expensive for someone to get on a bus. And let's not talk about the price of fuel at this moment in time. If you can't put fuel in your car, how are you getting to work? How are you taking your children to school? All these things have a knock-on effect, and are all things that the government at this moment in time can do something about. Increasing wages, regulating private landlords. When someone comes into you and says, my rent's gone up by £300 this month and my landlord's done that and I live in private accommodation, what do we offer at that point? Okay, we'll get in touch with your council, but the council doesn't have any housing at this moment in time. And if you're a single person, you've got no chance of being housed by the council. So it's like, what do you do to help these people? So these are all things that the government to do, like regulating these private landlords and saying to them, you can't put costs up in these areas. So I think if actions like that were taken by the government, then there's more chance of people surviving this cost of living crisis.
And something that you said, Amina, when we spoke previously, which I thought was very interesting, is the role of your organisation and the fact that when your workers and are making phone calls on behalf of women coming to your centre, that the phone calls are taking much longer. So actually, if you've got a 5-hour session worker, that they can only do 3 phone calls, where maybe a year ago they could do 5 phone calls. Yeah. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the role of organisations is, like of your organisation is in supporting women in the current crisis.
I think the role of organisations like myself is to support, to advocate on their behalf. These women come into the centre because they can't speak for themselves, and they're asking us to speak on their behalf and access the resources out there that are available. It could be that they don't even know what is actually available to them at this moment in time. Another thing that I think we play a big part is in upskilling these women. If there is a course available that we're doing in the range of activities that we're offering that can show them a skill that they have that they then can use to set up a private business, then that's something we're going to do. We've had women come in and they've taken part in sewing courses, they've taken part in food courses, and then they've said, oh, we're really good in this area. Oh, okay, then why don't you try and start your own little business in this area? Never thought about it before. But if we can help them, propel them in that way, then it's given them the skills to go out there and to hopefully change their situation, most definitely. Other things that we do at the same time as at GSWG is we advocate on behalf of the BAME community for those who face discrimination, to break down the barriers to access the service provision that is available out there. If you face a language barrier and you're calling Liverpool City Council and they don't have an interpreter on hand, there's nothing they can do at that point in time to help you. But if they come in here and we have support workers who speak community languages, then they're able to access that service provision that they wouldn't been able to at that point in time. So we're doing a lot of that. We're doing welfare checks, which are really important at this point in time, where people's mental health is not being looked at. During the pandemic, we were doing a lot of welfare checks, well-being checks, seeing how people were doing and things like that. And we've continued to do that because there's a lot of people who are in domestic violence situations and won't leave those situations. But if we can call every week to make sure that they are okay and they have what they need, then we're supporting them. So that's what organisations like ourselves do.
Really interesting. Thank you, Amina. And Sarah, from your perspective at Women's Budget Group, what do you think is the role of organisations like yours at this moment in time?
Well, I think our role is twofold. Certainly a big focus for us is trying to influence politicians and policymakers about what these fiscal interventions and support measures might look like, and ensuring that they are considering the gendered impact of those things. So, for example, when we had in the spring statement, we had the cut in fuel duty, who's going to benefit from that? Women rely on public transport, predominantly buses, and men are more likely to take long car journeys, right? So we're saying, all right, okay, we understand why that might be, kind of popular and that's a thing to do, but don't forget all the other ways, that all the other areas where support is needed, that where's that support getting to, and ensuring that those fiscal interventions and the help that we hope there's more help on the way, that it is really meeting the specific needs of women and girls throughout this crisis. And I think if we learned anything from the pandemic, I hope we did, I hope we did, although at the moment it's questionable, is that we don't all experience crises equally, right? Like, depending on where you're situated in the economy and society, you're going to feel a crisis in a very different way. And I think we have a situation at the moment where, yes, language that we had in the pandemic about we're all in this together is really helpful when you're trying to get people to be compliant with social distancing and stuff like that. But we are all experiencing this crisis very differently, and that language can really mask how people are experiencing it. So we really want to make sure that whatever is happening now in terms of government support and interventions, that we're not losing the focus on how different communities and different groups of people are going to be experiencing this crisis. And we have a situation, I think, where we've got, everyone is feeling it. Everyone's feeling the pressure. Some people are, paddling on the shoreline. Other people are drowning and being told from the shoreline, sorry, we got rid of all the life buoys over the last 13 years because we couldn't afford them, right? So our role is really in kind of refocusing the attention of people on those kind of different experiences. But the other role that we have to play as well, and I think this really speaks to, the holistic nature of the women's sector, we all have a role to play, a very, some of us on the front line, like Amina and Jan, and directly supporting women, we're a step back from that. But we see that our work and our research is really helping other women's organisations to, you know, to support their work. We're saying we're doing all this research or whatever, take it, use it, tell us what you need to be able to get the support and the intervention and the help that you need for the women that you're supporting. So I think that our role is twofold. It's that influential piece around policy and fiscal decisions, but it's also supporting other women's organisations as well with the work that we're doing and saying, you know, like, use our research to be able to get the support that you need as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And Jan, just before I bring you in, can I just tell the audience that if you've got questions that you want answering, I can see there's a lot in the chat, but it's much easier for us if you put it in the Q&A bit, because then I can keep track of it and we can make sure your question is asked. So please take your brilliant ideas that you've put in the chat, copy and paste them into the Q&A so that to make my life marginally easier. Thank you. And so Jan, over to you. What do you think of the role of organisations like yours and women and girls organisations generally, actually, in addressing the current crisis?
Well, I think the title that you chose for this session in relation to support work is very apt, you know, a port in a storm. Personally, I often find it quite uncomfortable, you know, when women are expressing their thanks and their gratitude for something like a £35 fuel grant, you know, and you feel like saying it's not coming out of my pocket, you know, but the fact of the matter is it's very often coming out of an individual's pocket, because we have to use donations, individual donations, to support a lot of that work going forward. So I think community-based organisations are absolutely invaluable as that access point for people, and obviously where people have English as a second language, or if they're newly settled here, or if they're in very different circumstances because of fleeing violence, they don't necessarily know how to negotiate the system, and they very often want to go to an organisation where there's people like them there, you know, whether it's BME people, disabled women, or women that have suffered violence. So to have these organisations available within our sort of cities and towns is really, really important. I think it's really important that there's in-person services and not just online services. The work that we do ourselves has changed completely, really, from working with women in sort of empowerment activities, for want of a better word, to much more advocacy and individual support because of the urgency of the different problems that women are facing. In a wider sense, I think third sector women's organisations are absolutely essential as a way of amplifying the voices and the issues that individual women are experiencing. It's not about speaking for women, it's about speaking on behalf of women. I don't think it's appropriate, you know, for a woman who's suffered violence or who's, you know, in extreme poverty to have to come forward and tell her story necessarily, although some women do that very powerfully. But organisations like ourselves can sort of provide intelligence on how the cost of living crisis is affecting women, children and communities, and also like identify emerging issues and new areas of need or points in the system where things are not working. So I think it's very important that third sector organisations have a voice on strategic and policy forums as well, at like both the local council levels and also national government, and we're involved in various Scottish Government working groups. So part of what we do in our work is carve out a bit of space for working with women in a way that allows their voices to be heard without them having to necessarily identify themselves. For example, a piece of work my colleague did around about the sex industry called Inside Outside Scotland, sorry, Inside Outside the Sex Industry in Scotland. You can find it on WordPress. has stories of women who've been involved in the sex industry, and that had a powerful impression both on service providers and on politicians and policymakers. So I think there's lots of third sector women's organisations, and very often they've been supported by Rosa through small grants, who've done that sort of work, engaging with communities. It's hard to get the time for that when you know how much individual support is needed, but I think it's really, really important that we continue to do that.
That's so helpful, Jan. And I'm conscious I've got some questions coming in, and I've also had a question of, can I remind the audience who all the speakers are? So apologies for not doing that because some people did arrive late. So we've got Amina Elmi from Granby Somali Women's Project. We've got Jan MacLeod from the Women's Support Project in Scotland, and we've got Sarah Ronan from the Women's Budget Group. And we have some questions in the Q&A, and just before I go to them, and I'm conscious of the time, I don't want to take up more time, but just to say that I think between the three of you, you really have set the scene at the kind of national, but also at the local level, about the myriad ways that the cost of living crisis is impacting women now. But also what I've been struck by, what you've been talking about, is the impact it's having on women, on children and on families, and the tail of it will be very long. That it isn't just that it's happening to women now, the impact of it will be felt for decades to come. And so if I go to some of the questions, we've got some question from an anonymous attendee. Essentially, how long can this continue? Is there really nobody, and is there really not the government who could step in and help? And I suppose I might put that to Sarah, actually, because just I feel that you have a kind of, you haven't got a hotline to government, but you yeah, you wish. But whether in any of your kind of conversations at a national level, you're getting any sense of urgency from any government departments saying that something must be done and will be done?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we feel like there is an emergency budget coming. There's going to be more help. There's going to have to be more help, because I think as well, there's this kind of, there's two things kind of going on. There is the never underestimate what it can do to write to your MP. MPs' inboxes getting full of the same complaints over and over again, and eventually that starts feeding in, you know, and has that kind of impact on kind of, particularly with backbench MPs and stuff, of influencing kind of what's happening and where the government are putting their attention. So I think that certainly in their constituencies, MPs are really hearing a lot of what we've been talking about today, a lot of the stories that Amina and Jan have shared. MPs are hearing that in their constituencies at the moment as well. And I think they'll hear that more as we come up to like summer recess and Parliament breaks for recess and they go back to their constituencies for the summer. They're going to be hearing that even more. They're going to be hearing about school meal, you know, the lack of meals during the school holidays. They're going to be hearing about concerns about the price cap coming up and stuff like that. So I think all of that is probably going to like help push that, you know, push the government into more action. I think the other thing as well around this is that there's obviously the other political concerns that the government have around their own popularity that's going to kind of pressure them into doing stuff as well. So that's no bad thing. And I think the other thing to kind of say is that I think that there is a sense of everybody has had enough after the last few years, and that in terms of action and this kind of groundswell of kind of action and campaigning is really, really going to help keep the pressure on, basically. And we see it even, for example, with childcare. You know, we've seen a flurry of activity around childcare in the last couple of months. And at the Women's Budget Group, we're working on the launch of a coalition for childcare reform, where we're bringing everyone together. And that's kind of one of those issues over the last few years that people have just gradually, it's just got so bad. And I think it is really about and you see it with the strikes, not just with the rail strikes, but you know, junior barristers and junior doctors, it's all just kind of hitting the tipping point. So I think that there is the kind of political pressure the government is under anyway, which is going to kind of push them into doing something. But I think there's a role as well for campaign organisations just to really keep the pressure on, because I think there's a way of harnessing that kind of that feeling that people have had enough. There's a way of harnessing that and leveraging it to be able to get some positive kind of steps and actions out of the government.
And actually, I mean, Amina and Jan, and I'm working in a Scottish, but I wondered whether there's a question here about how we can educate local authorities to put their funding into women's organisations and to the range of women's organisations, and particularly, I think, to specialist organisations such as your own, Amina. And I wondered whether what your kind of relationship was like, Amina, at a local level with local government, and whether they're open to supporting women more at a local level.
I have a question. Granby Somali Women's.
Amina, can you hear me? Have you frozen? Yeah. Oh yes, so I can see you. Sorry, I think you froze or I froze. One of us froze.
Sorry. I am Liverpool at the moment. We work very well with Liverpool City Council, and it's the first time that we've had a black mayor in Liverpool who's a woman at the end of the day, and she's someone that we've worked with previously. She understands the issues that the community faces and women and girls face, most definitely. The problem we have in Liverpool is the fact that Liverpool City Council, I think, is in 400 million in debt at this moment in time, so they don't have the funds or the resources to work with women's organisations and give them the funds that they need. So it's up to organisations in Liverpool like my own to actually look elsewhere for that funding.
Right, yeah. And sorry, either I froze or you froze a little bit, so sorry, I looked a bit odd at that moment. And Jan, in terms of the Scottish context, what's your relationship like with Scottish government? Are they putting any support to address the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, we work quite closely with the Scottish government, and they do work. They do have a strategy, Equally Safe in Scotland, for specifically for addressing violence against women. But within that, obviously, they're looking at the impact of the cost of living crisis. During the pandemic, one of the sort of slightly ironic things was it was much easier to get money for destitution relief. And it's become much more difficult again since. One of the things in Glasgow that's happened that's making a tremendous difference to families is that given free bus passes to children. So that means that your children can, you know, go to their swimming, their school or whatever, and you don't have the bus fares anymore. And that really has made a vast difference. I think the other advantage that we have in Scotland is that because there is a national strategy, I'm talking here again about violence against women organisations specifically, each local authority area has a violence against women partnership. And it's really important that women's organisations, not just violence against women's ones, but poverty and childcare women's organisations as well, have some sort of link with these partnerships. And again, for example, in Glasgow, the council, through the Violence Against Women Partnership, have been addressing the cost of living. They've piloted a fund called Make a House a Home, where women who've had who've experienced violence can get additional support to sustain them in their tenancy. So it will provide items, furnishings and so on that you can't get through the welfare fund. Now, just that one small thing takes away a huge area of stress and anxiety for women and children in that situation.
That's really helpful. And again, apologies. I think my internet's very unstable at the moment, so I'm must be looking a bit slow. But that's really, really helpful. And actually, there's been another question come in, which does sort of link into this one, which is about your own organisations and whether your own like how you're finding in terms of accessing funding at a time when you know that inflation is rising and you know, the cost of living is also rising. And I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about how it's impacting your own organisations and your own workforce in terms of the cost of living crisis. And so, Amina, I'll start with you on that one.
I think during COVID and the pandemic, there was a lot of funding available at that time that could help organisations, and we were able to tap into that. Since the cost of living crisis has come into effect, I think it's become extremely harder. There's been a clampdown on the amount of funding that's available out there. I think for every piece of funding, there's maybe 100 organisations applying, and God knows how many of them actually are allocated the funding. So I think it's extremely hard at this moment in time for us as an organisation. And that then filters down to those who are working within the organisation and wondering whether, you know, they have one-year contracts at this moment in time. Will those contracts be renewed, and how will the cost of living crisis actually affect them if their wages aren't going up in line with actually inflation? So I think it has a knock-on effect, most definitely. And we as an organisation, it's all about sustainability and how we can get to that sustainability. And it's something that I, as the project manager, work towards every single day. But at this moment in time, I'd say it's extremely difficult. And like those people who are living through the cost of living crisis, organisations like ourselves are living in that situation with funding.
Thank you, Amina. And Sarah, how's it impacting on Women's Budget Group and in terms of your fundraising?
Yeah, I think the challenges are similar because, you know, all the work that we're doing externally, those challenges are being experienced by people internally as well, you know, and you're trying to balance those, you know, things like salary increases against the need to be sustainable, and the fact that the funding is maybe there for 2 years, you know, and so like we can't, like, how do you maintain those, you know, cost of living wage increases, like if the funding, you know, there's a finite amount of funding and stuff. So it's definitely created challenges. But I think for us, you know, we have an incredibly supportive board who are really proactive about that, and kind of, you know, kind of proactively kind of said, you know, the pay increase that we agreed at the start of the year is clearly not sufficient looking at inflation, you know, but it does create challenges, and it creates pressure on staff. Originally, I'm a single parent, so I'm feeling it, like, personally as well, you know, and everybody has those challenges and stuff. But I think in terms of like funding, what we are seeing, I think, is that because during the pandemic, we produced an inordinate amount of research. It was just reams and reams and reams of reports on the unequal impact of the pandemic. And I think that's kind of positioned us in a way that funders can see that that research is really useful in terms of this crisis as well. And so that we're fortunate enough that our funders have been really kind of supportive in us trying to continue that research and highlighting that gendered impact. But we are, like every organisation, kind of really trying to walk that fine line between being sustainable and paying staff so that they can cope and live with it. But I sorry, just before we move on, I do think there's one point to make about it, that like, I think there is a role for funders here as well, in being proactive in challenging organisations around what they're paying. And in the way that you have things like ESG criteria for investors, that there needs to be something there around, like where when in funding bids, some kind of, you know, like some kind of accountability around, you need to be paying your staff this kind of money so that they can cope with it. We have to put our money where our mouth is in the women's sector, I think.
That's a really, really good point, actually. Thank you, Sarah. And Jan, I'll ask you to answer that question about the impact it's having on your organisation.
We've noticed for a few years, even before the pandemic, I mean, really since the last banking crisis, was it, that it's much harder to get a grant, say through some of the big charitable trusts, they're getting less money, so they're giving out smaller grants. So it's hard to get a grant that will fund even like a full-time post and activity costs. So in order to get a full-time post, you might need 2 or 3 or even more grants, and then you might need to look elsewhere for little sums of money for your development budget or activity cost or whatever. And if you're a small organisation, you don't have a full-time finance worker or something like that, that has got a knock-on effect. Similarly, whilst it was essential and very helpful to access the additional funding that was available during the pandemic, almost all of that didn't come with any sort of management or admin cost attached. So you were having to administer giving out funds, poverty relief and that out of existing budgets. And again, most small women's organisations don't have massive reserves, not least because if you've got massive reserves, you'll not get grants. So it's been like, it's a vicious circle really. And the knock-on effect of that is, and I noticed a question in the chat about how can we persuade people not to put all their funding into a single organisation. So a knock-on effect of all that is that it's much harder to get funding from councils or the larger trusts for the first time. And in Scotland, I mean, we're not a BME-led organisation, but we do have the 2 projects that are working with BME communities at the moment. And through colleagues in the sector, I would say for the fact that BME organisations are underfunded even in comparison with other community organisations. I think that probably goes for other equality groups as well. But it's, those communities need to be resourced and funded so that they can work in their own communities, because obviously they are the experts in their communities and what's needed and what works. So I think we need to look at that. How do we not just stay in existing ones, but fund new ones?
Brilliant, thank you, Jan. I'm so sorry that my internet has really failed, so I've massively overrun on this session. And I just wanted to conclude by thanking all of you, Amina, Sarah, and Jan, and by saying I think that what's been so interesting about what you've talked about is not only the kind of breadth and the depth of this crisis, but the extent of it. And I think what I'm sort of left with is, have we ever seen anything like it in our lifetimes? It looks and feels different. And I think partly because of the work that the organisations like Women's Budget Group do in really bringing the evidence to the surface, like we know so much more than we used to know about different women's life experiences. But also because Amina and Jan, the work you're doing not only to represent women and girls, but also to inform the rest of us and to support women and girls about what is happening. And I think it's beholden on all of us, and it's definitely beholden on Rosa. And I hear you, Sarah, about what can funders do as a funder for us to think about the ways that we can support organisations like yours, but also encourage other funders to support organisations like yours, because this feels like it's going to get much, much worse before it gets better. And the tail of it will be very, very long. Intergenerational and very long. I'm going to draw the session to a close before my internet fails again, but to say that there are now new sessions for you to go to, and one is using data to achieve change, and the other one, and someone's put it in the chat, I think, what the next one is as well. It's collaborate and connect with 3 organisations. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to the audience. And I'm really sorry that I've run over because of the internet, but it's brilliant to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.